Well, good afternoon, everybody, at least here on the East Coast, as I think it's late morning on the West Coast. Welcome to the Movement Capture Conversation. Today, we're exploring the power of philanthropy. And to be blunt, we're going to interrogate the power that funders have to change the direction and the priorities of the organizations they fund. Now, this event is part of the Realizing Democracy series, which is co-hosted by the Ford Foundation, Open Society Foundations, Demos, and Community Change. And we're grateful, very grateful to our friends at The Forge for hosting today's event. My name is Dorian Warren, and I'm the co-president of Community Change, and I'm super excited and thrilled to be joined by two amazing people that I happen to know very well and who inspire me. Dr. Professor Megan Ming Francis and comrade Maurice Mitchell. Welcome to this event. Dr. Francis is an associate professor of political science at the University of Washington, and Mr. Mitchell is the national director of the Working Families Party. Both are true rock stars in their own right, and actually one is a literal rock star, but that's for another conversation. They are both truth tellers, they are both organizers, and they are the finest public intellectuals I know who come from a very long and storied tradition grounded in the Black freedom movement. Today, we're going to talk about some of the themes and ideas that were recently raised in a video released that features Megan and Maurice talking about movement capture. And if you haven't had a chance to see the video, you can find it at www.realizingdemocracy.org. We'll put that link in the chat. So after we finish this conversation, you can go watch it. You can share it with friends and colleagues. Before we launch into the conversation, though, I just want to start on a very personal note, both to you, Megan and Maurice. How the hell are you doing? How are you holding up in this moment? It's been, I don't know what to say, a year and a half, 5 years, I don't know, a lifetime. Like, how the hell are y'all doing right now? How are you holding up? Maurice.
Okay, well, wow. Well, I was agitated by somebody. I had a call this morning, and this concept in my head is just kind of like I've been wrestling with it. So I don't know if you remember, right, in the beginning of the Trump years, people were sort of saying and posting, this isn't normal, right? And people talked about how we had to fight not to normalize all of the Trumpist abuses and everything that was going on. And I feel like somebody needs to like scream from the rafters, this still isn't normal. Right? I mean, we've been through more than a year of COVID, and it's almost like we've kind of gotten numb to the reality, and it's kind of in the background, but there's nothing normal about living through a global pandemic or the white supremacist violence that's taking place, or any of these things. And I've just been kind of wrestling with how that is washing over me, just like as a person, not just as a strategist. 2021, like personally, has been like a kind of personally and politically, I think, has been a transition year as we figure out how. And I figure out personally how to position myself politically when Democrats have trifecta control of the federal government. But that doesn't necessarily mean that our movement is in control of the federal government. And it's much more, it's easier and clearer for a movement, a progressive movement, or the United Front that includes a lot of partners that understands itself as a movement, to respond to a far-right fascist government is very clearer. When you're dealing with Democrats who include, columns of organized capital and some progressives and others, sometimes securing some concessions that we're proud of, but then not winning enough. How do you strike the balance of being able to mark victories, but also demand more? And I think we're trying to figure that out at a time when we've won electorally, but we haven't necessarily won the broader political fight. We won electorally, which meant Donald Trump is no longer president. Good thing in the world, right? But insufficient. And so it's a kind of uncomfortable feeling trying to wrestle with those contradictions.
You're starting on fire. Okay.
I
Just
know.
drop that in the beginning. Sure. Dr. Francis, how you holding up?
Doing okay. I also just really want to first say I'm just in deep gratitude to Dorian Warren and Maurice Mitchell and the opportunity to be in conversation with both of you, whose work I admire so much. I'm doing okay. I think for me, it's been a long, stressful 18 months, 2 years. It's the kind of how Maurice began, like how long has it actually been? I admit for me, I took a lot of the summer off. This is one of two only speaking engagements I've had since June. I woke up one day early June and was like, I can't do this anymore. I have been going nonstop since May of 2020, and I don't have anything left. Like the gas is gone. And I did something that I never do before, which is I actually pulled out of engagements that I had committed to because I just needed to protect myself. And I needed to also take stock of everything that has happened in my life and in this world. And so June, July, and August was all about that. And now I'm kind of like over the last 2 weeks reemerging, and it's like, what's changed? A lot has changed. A lot is still the same. There's an incredible amount of work to do. And at least from some corners of the public, less energy and willingness to actually engage in that type of work. For me, as somebody who's always concerned about the specter of racial violence, that's still very much here. That has not gone anywhere. And so how do we see things with new lens because we have a new administration in charge? Yeah, and so I think one of the things that Maurice said that really resonated with me, and I'll end here, is like, how do we mark the victories as well as to understand there's so much work moving forward. And I'm really excited to kind of think through what that work might look like with you all today.
Both of y'all giving us a lot to think about just as the opening. So let's get further into the conversation, and let me remind those of you watching as we go, if there are questions or comments that you might have, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll try to cover as many as we can before we have to wrap up. But we have a lot of ground and territory to cover here. So let me jump in with the first question about philanthropy. So as you both talk about in the video that I mentioned earlier, philanthropy can often treat symptoms and not root causes. Often philanthropy pushes many of us, looking at you, Maurice, to deal with things that feel solvable on a short time frame while leaving untouched the underlying systems and structures. So if you think about, let me just give you a quick example. Foundations might often be more comfortable thinking about increasing, say, rates of Black home ownership than they are challenging a system of racial capitalism and a system that treats housing as a commodity. What we might say in more academic lingo, like a neoliberal racial order in some ways. So what would it look like? Here's the question. What would it look like to create new paradigms to solve deep problems rather than simply creating more tolerable conditions, as you say in that video, Maurice? So I'm going to actually start with you and then toss to Megan.
Okay. Yeah. A nice early softball question, right? Just to warm us up. Well, all right. Creating new paradigms, I think, requires that funders engage in deep trust, right? Like when I do movement work, I often say we move at the speed of trust, right? And ultimately, where people, societies are human systems, we rely on trust. And I think that needs to be the core. I mean, what would it look like if that was like the core of a funding strategy, right? And partnership, and I think partnership, that language suggests that it's an equally yoked relationship. And there's just very real power imbalances because there's folks with money and then folks trying to get the money, right? So what would it look like if there's intentionality around creating partnership and centering around trust? And then I think in the context of trust and partnership, you could begin to have really interesting conversations around what does in that long-term relationship, long-term movement building look like, and support for long-term movement building, right? Yeah, I think like there's nothing quote unquote wrong with focusing on proximal issues. I think the problem is when there is a focus on proximal issues at the expense of thinking about long-term strategy, and there's a focus on tactics outside of a strategy, right? So I think, I think one of the long-term impacts of philanthropy focusing on the proximal and the countable, that has sort of yoked and pulled the movement and practitioners away from our strategic sensibilities towards more tactical sensibilities, because you could kind of count the tactics. You could say, hey, we did this thing, and then this very concrete thing happened, and then you could kind of put it in a grant report. It's harder to sort of discuss what a generational strategy looks like. However, the things that are the most impactful are the generational strategies. We are living inside of the end of a 40-year one-sided class war that was organized in a very sophisticated way and funded in a very sophisticated way by the ultra far right, right? So that means that their donors, their funders, themselves, they were able to take the time to develop a long-term ideological strategy and be committed to it and have a lot of tolerance for all types of changes, right? It wasn't like an inevitable strategy, right? But it's one that they had ideological commitment to, and they backed it up with billions of dollars over time. And so what would it look like if we released ourselves from the tactical, which means having tolerance for losses, so that we could picture what the 50-year strategy might look like and think about the ecosystem that might be supported in order to achieve that 50-year strategy.
You said a lot there, and we're going to come back later on to the metrics and measurement question for sure. But Megan, same question for you. What would it look like to create new paradigms to solve deep problems rather than simply creating more tolerable conditions?
Yeah, no, that was a great set of remarks from Maurice. I just also want to asterisk wanting to come back to becoming tolerable failures later on in our conversation. But to address this question, Dorian, I think that what's been really interesting for me as I've had a few months of reflection now is that the public reckoning that has been had over the last year about the structuring role of racial violence is not new. I think that that's really important, right, to say that it's a cycle. And it will continue to reoccur if we treat just the symptoms and not the underlying issues. In some ways, not always, but in some ways, I think that the focus on symptoms has allowed funders to get off the hook for not making a bigger commitment and allowing more room for organizers to think about a different set of strategies or for an actual focus on institutions and structures to actually emerge. I very much agree that you need both. Right, that there needs to be a focus on the symptoms, but that focus on the symptoms has seemingly come to occupy a larger space for funders than when you talk to organizers than they would actually like. So to kind of get to the second part is kind of what would it look like to create a new paradigm? I think if funders are really interested in creating new paradigms and solving problems, as their websites and their press releases allege, I think it would mean being honest about what the problem actually is that is in need of solving. I often think that funders lie to themselves a lot about the nature of the problem and what is required of them to fix it, right? That so there has been, especially not just this last year, but let's say 2-3 years, it's been the problem is that there's police officers. The problem is that there's not enough body cameras. The problem is that certain communities don't have the resources that they need. Those are all problems, right? But there's also larger problems and systemic issues that are not being addressed. And I think most of all, for me, at least when I look at a lot of the funders, especially funders who have said that this is what the work that they want to do now, right? Post-May 2020, post-June 2020, that it would require a commitment to a vision of structural transformation. It would require funders on the left and those in the center to be clear about what they stand for and what their political commitments are, we know for sure that there has been a reliance on technocratic metrics, right? And a kind of a shying away from this is what we actually stand for, and this is the world that we actually want to live in from funders. That is not, and if you look in terms of how the right has actually funded through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that is not what the right has done. The right has been very clear about what their political projects are, what their commitment is. And so I think in terms of moving forwards, that type of like very clear commitment, saying what it is, would be helpful to shifting the paradigm and necessary. Because let's be clear, and this is the last thing I'll say on this, is that the funding environment that many organizations are trying to navigate around is a vulnerable funding climate, right? And they understand very clearly, viscerally, that their funding may end from year to year. And the funders right now have the audacity to believe that like long-term funding is 2 years and 5 years, and that is not true, right? That conservative funders, if you examine them in the 80s and 90s, have long told us that long-term funding means 10, 20 years and for a lifetime.
I just heard the loud sound of a mic drop. So I'm going to stay with you, Megan, on this question.
Okay.
Because you mentioned May and June of 2020. So I actually do want you to take us back to last summer.
Okay.
And ask you to talk to us about what you see as both the challenges and the opportunities in the way philanthropy responded to the racial justice uprisings of last summer. Then I'll come back to Maurice after Megan.
So I think that there were a lot of opportunities. It was interesting. So during the time, or like right in the aftermath, is I taught this class, philanthropy and social movements at the Kennedy School, and it ended in May. The class like ended in May, and then everything jumped off. And in my class, we spoke a lot about the kind of the bureaucratic red tape of funders and how funders have helped harmed social movements. And one of the things that became clear, at least in terms of racial justice uprisings of this last year, is that the kind of the bureaucratic red tape that prevented funders from doing more was stripped away, right? That that they could actually move pretty quickly, that they didn't actually need a whole funding cycle to actually fund organizations because the need was so strong. There was also, I think, one of the opportunities is for a larger focus on state violence. I think violence has been this thing, not just for funders, I think, but for a lot of the American public who purport to care about democracy and the strength of democracy, in some way shy away from, because it's so big, right? People are like, Megan, how do we solve state violence? It's a big issue, like, no doubt. But instead of like focusing on the issue of state violence, we tend to focus on the processes through which state violence is actually exercised, right? And it's seemingly in this moment, there's a larger focus on that, which was like, for myself and many others, Maurice and Dorian as well, have been saying for a long time that that is something that needs to be focused on. And people have been like, ooh, right? Like the most that we can think about is criminal justice reform. And then finally, there was a little bit of an opening. And that brings me to, I think, the other, I think, big opening in terms of, for me in thinking about, especially the world of funders and philanthropic institutions, especially for a lot of staff who work at philanthropic institutions, that the door had been pushed open just a little bit more than it had been before. And what you saw in a number of philanthropic institutions is organizing and new initiatives taking place. As well as for people to make connections between violence of the state and different issues, right? Such as poverty, right? Such as housing and such as climate, right? There is a notable funder who focuses on climate who was like, hey, you know what? We actually can't do a focus on climate without addressing racial violence. Like that's actually not possible, which is, I think, really big. In terms of the challenges, we can talk more about this later, and it's obviously in the video, but I think the challenge, there's a lot of challenges, but for me, one of the ones that I, of course, think about the most is capture. There is an increased amount of resources, still not enough, but there's an increased amount.
So I'm going to ask you to define what you mean by capture, just so that people on the call they're sharing our vocabulary. Say how you define capture. What do you mean by that?
Right. So I tend to define, I do define capture as the shifting of the agenda and strategies of social movement organizations by well-intentioned funders. I sometimes distinguish it from something such as co-optation, which implies like power, intention, and or bad intentions behind it. I think capture happens oftentimes with the best of intentions, right? This is the reason why I use the NAACP and the Garland Fund in my historical example, because people, I think, in the past and in the early 20th century, which I focus on, through the mid 20th century, and certainly in the present, mean to do well. They're people who we like, people who we would have at dinner parties maybe, right? And yet, they are unaware of the power of their money and the power and the way that power operates in these types of relationships and the ways that agendas and strategies can shift. And so with this increase in funding for a number of these, for the movement, I think that even with the best of intentions, I worry about the interaction and the involvement of some funders with different organizations affiliated with the Black Lives Matter movement and thinking about questions of accountability and the future of the movement as it regards to strategy and agenda.
So Marie, same question. Challenges and opportunities you see in the way philanthropy showed up, responded to the racial justice uprisings of last summer?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that frame. And I kind of want to just sort of segue, borrowing that frame, right? Just in general, it's beneficial for the people who are holding up the status quo, the people currently in power, for us to decontextualize our analysis, to think about us as individuals, to look at problems as being individual problems, to not look at the root causes, to look at the symptoms. Like that level of analysis actually helps sort of reinscribe and recreate the current system as it is, right? And so, part of this sort of just philosophically and sort of in terms of how we analyze our place in society, our institutions' place, is choosing to have a structural and systems analysis of the problem and ourselves, and being insistent in maintaining that structural analysis, right? And so, to me, when I think about how that plays into these movement moments, right? These movement moments, I think are ideal for philanthropy as it is, because philanthropy is actually really good at rapid response and sort of a crisis sort of giving and sort of a la carte giving or tactical giving. And these movement moments are rife with tactics, are rife with very specific opportunities to give to very specific concrete things, specific leaders, specific direct actions, you name it, conferences, convenings, things of those nature. Now, and it makes sense, right? Because crises sort of like open up all of these opportunities and all of these actions. But there's something problematic about that, because that creates a boom and bust cycle, which just isn't sustainable, right? And so we need, if we develop, and if we have before the crisis, if we've developed a systemic analysis of what our role is, let's say as philanthropists, or our role wherever we are in society, when that crisis happens, sure, we could do the rapid response giving, right? But with intention on ensuring that we don't participate in a boom bust cycle, right? Because money isn't everything, right? It isn't, in its inert phase, it isn't anything, right? It's only animated by ideas. And applied haphazardly, money could actually cause more problems, even with good intentions, like you were saying, right?
No money, no problems. I'm
yes,
sorry, the song is in my head.
That's real. Like, Biggie is among many things, top 5 dead or alive, and also like a great Marxist philosopher, right? And so, right, like money escalates conflicts if it's applied haphazardly. It could disrupt, on the ground, movements for change, their ability to strategize. And so we're 1 year out from the George Floyd uprisings, and I think we need to ask questions, and I think funders need to ask some fundamental questions, like where are all of those last year funders who gave in that moment? What are their commitments now? What are their long-term commitments? And then, yes, Megan, I agree, long-term isn't like multi-year by 3 or 5 year, but 10, 20, 30 year. What is the long-term commitment to movements? And how supported are the leaders today, right? How held are the leaders today a year out? And how engaged today are all the new activists who caught the spark, right? Where are they, and how are they being supported, right? These are really critical questions a year out in order to ensure that we're not participating in a boom bust, because that bust side of it, there's harm there. Those are people and communities that experience the downside of the bust. But during that bust, philanthropy could experience the upside and say like, hey, we gave to all of these movements, right? And so how do we interrupt that? That is something that folks in philanthropy could actually do. And I think the way that happens is by thinking structurally, what is my responsibility to ensure that we flatten the curve of that boom bust, and we utilize that moment in order to actually shift the way that we do things in perpetuity, right? And I think everybody has a role in that.
Flatten the curve of the boom bust cycle. For the funders on the call, I hope you heard that. So Megan, I'm gonna come back to you first on this next question, because I wanna return to the topic of metrics. So I'm gonna ask actually both of you, like, bear with me for a minute. Like, I have 3 to 4 questions here. I'm just gonna put them all on the table and then just respond, but it's all in the category of metrics and measurements and time horizon. So we know that grant reports often rely on short-term, easily quantifiable metrics, usually often dictated by funders. So how can funders shift from overvaluing, frankly, what's easy to measure versus the metrics necessary for long-term movement building that are always harder to count? So that's one element of the question. Another element is, how do we shift philanthropy's view of what we can actually accomplish, say in 1 year for a $50,000 grant? Like, that's still how too much of philanthropy operates. A third question is, in this category, how do we change our time horizons and the ways we're measuring impact? Say, is it over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, as you both have previewed? And maybe I'll sum it up by saying, why are you two so opposed to measuring impact? That's the trick part. Yeah. Megan, you first.
Oh my goodness. That's like
Arvind, take any pieces of those you want. Take any pieces of those you want in the category of measurement and metrics.
All right. Okay. No, I think that the measurement and evaluation questions are really important. I think in part because that is what a lot of funders are wrestling with right now. A large part of this is, how do you shift the culture of philanthropic institutions that has relied so heavily on technocratic metrics and to evaluate impact. I'm actually not saying that we shouldn't measure impact. What I am saying is that the way that we have been measuring impact on the side of funders for especially a lot of like left and center funders has not actually been useful and is detrimental if we actually want large scale structure and institutional change. What I often say is that, for example, if we look at the Black Lives Matter movement right now in 2020, most funders on the left would say, oh my gosh, this is successful. We want to get in, right? This is why you saw the splashing of, these are the organizations that we funded, even though they really didn't, right? Or those were going to be hit in the next funding cycle. But the reason why I say that is because in 2015 and 2017, if you funded organizations, and some people did, not as many that should have, that were associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, what would you have said in terms of how could you account for their impact, right? There wasn't a dramatic set of laws. There was a sit down with President Obama, right? There was a slight shift in public opinion in terms of support for the Black Lives Matter movement. But how would you justify $1 million, $2 million, $3 million for the movement? And so the reason why I'm saying that is I think that for a number of funders now and corporations who are eager to support the movement, that set, kind of the traditional set of metrics, would not have fit well, and it would not have served them well. That doesn't mean that in 2015 and 2017, right, we're all here in this call, students of the Black Freedom Movement. That isn't to say that in 2015 and 2017, the movement didn't have impact and wasn't already doing big things, right? And if you would ask many people who were on the ground, who were part of it, Maurice, of course, like there are different ways that one could measure impact, that one could see in terms of the progress of the movement. And so what I'm saying here is that I think a number of funders need to be in conversation with organizations that they actually fund. They need to think about impact in a very different way than they do right now. There has been a reliance on quantitative metrics and not qualitative metrics. And so what would it look like that instead of program officers, many of which who actually have no expertise in movement building, what would it look like if you actually had organizers actually set the terms of what the impact measurements would actually look like? And I think then in terms of, I think you would have kind of a much richer conversation in terms of between organizers and foundation staff about kind of what type of impact that they might be looking for, and in terms of the type of impact that they'd be willing and comfortable to support. I think connectedly here, what I'm also drawing out in terms of the kind of some of your questions, Dorian, about kind of how do we get people at the foundation level to kind of transform the metrics that they have right now. I think one of the big things, and this isn't just because I'm a college professor, is that I think that we need more education, right? That like everybody wants to support movement building right now. Like what? like you would never let somebody go in terms of like economic policy without an understanding of like econometrics. Like that wouldn't happen. And yet we allow people to make determinations about movements for people who have had no history, whether it's Chicano organizing, Black organizing in the United States. And I think that like understanding how movements form, how they endure, how they grow is actually, to me, like the floor of what it means to like fund movements and where people should actually be, not just program officers, but also executive and at the level presidents and board. And I think that would help us to accept longer time horizons. The thing I always say to my students is that as a forever student of the Black Freedom Movement, I don't know one history, I don't know one movement, social movement in the United States led by people of color that has not had multiple failures, right? That have been associated with it. And so failure has to be a part of it. But if you don't understand movement building in this country, that is lost on you, right? So I think that's part of it. Maurice is probably going to take it and do so much more with this question, but I just wanted to get it started.
Already it's only 1:36 my time and I'm feeling like I need some tequila on the rocks. So Maurice, there's a lot happening here. I love this. So you are the organizer here, and Megan has a proposition she just said about what would it mean for organizers and movement leaders to help determine what are the measurements or metrics of impact. So anything you want to respond to on this topic, sir?
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of amens and, a lot of finger snaps and affirmatives. So I'm just gonna kind of like build on that. So yeah, I mean, I don't think neither of us are arguing that impact isn't important, but who defines impact, right? I think that's the question, right? And in that relationship, to me, naturally, the people who should define impact are the practitioners, right? And so what would it look like if we were able to define impact based on what we actually knew was effective. I do think that what tends to happen is you report on the things that are the easiest to report on, the easiest to count. There is a implied sort of sense that scale just is somehow better, and the bigger the number that you could write somewhere, the more important or powerful or impactful the work that you're doing is, which isn't true, right? Things like leadership development, right? Being able to support people in their leadership over time. It's really hard to measure that. But what we do know is that very skilled, sophisticated leaders have the ability to spark movements, have the ability to organize people in their communities in very deep and sometimes very large scale ways. And if those leaders weren't supported and nurtured and trained and given the tools that they needed over time, so that their leadership potential could be realized, then we wouldn't be in the positions that we're in. And there's no easy way quantitatively to be able to suss that out, but there are qualitative measures to be able to really discuss how you're effective at providing leadership development. Political education also is critical. Like how do you effectively count providing excellent and popular political education in a way that that holds, so that people's consciousness is transformed, right? You could count the number of people that go to a webinar, but you can't necessarily count the transformation of consciousness, right? Which is ultimately what we're trying to do, right? And then, to me, ultimately, if we could have an approach that seeks to understand the impact over time of an ecosystem versus trying to thin slice particular actors or particular organizations, I think we would have a better accounting of what's actually happening, because movement is the interrelationship and interplay of a number of actors, some of which might be deeply aligned, some of which might be in contention, right? And so there's actually like actors in ecosystems that might be in disagreement, but generative disagreement, right? And because of that disagreement, because of maybe the dialectical sort of struggle that's taking place, there's something that emerges that is transformative, right? You can't capture that or understand that or be able to assess its impact if you're just thin slicing, or if all you're doing is counting the actors in the ecosystem that are the safest and closest to you, right? So funders are going to give to the organizations or actors or activists that are the safest. So what would it look like if you have a tolerance for discomfort, you have a tolerance for supporting actors in the field whose theory of change creates some discomfort, you're not 100% that feeling of discomfort actually is a really good one. We want to stand in that discomfort and figure out how we as organizers, that's really what we should be doing, standing in the margins, standing in the theater of discomfort in order to push the boundaries of what's possible. What would it look like if folks in philanthropy chose to do that? And so, because if what you're doing is selecting only the grantees that are the most comfortable, then in some ways what you're doing is you're selecting a column of actors who align with you, right? And then you're supercharging the folks who already align with your presupposed philosophy of how change happens. And then you end up using that relationship as a tool for how you think things should happen, right? And so how can you create the conditions where you're like, all right, I'm supporting this ecosystem. Things are going to happen that I probably will disagree with. That's okay, because we don't have all the answers. And over time, we're going to learn a lot. The last thing I'll say is that around the tolerance for failure, right? There's the survivorship sort of fallacy where when we see something pop And they were like, look, that person or organization, they're geniuses. And we need to follow through everything that they did. And everything that they did up until that point was genius, right? And then what we're doing is we're missing out on all the learning that takes place when people don't pop, right? There's so much learning in that, right? And a lot of times people stumble into something. So it's like, it wasn't genius. I just stumbled into figuring something out. It's not like I had this like sage plan. A lot of quote unquote success happens for reasons that sometimes the people who are like the recipients of the success don't fully understand either, right? And so what would it look like if we just had more of like a Zen-like sort of like equanimous sort of relationship with success and failure? And we recognize that in an ecosystem, there's going to be a lot of things happening. And we want to appreciate all of it because it's the interplay of all those things over time that leads to the structural change, not the like momentary successes or losses and how many we could count. It's like, well, you know, think about the legislation that we won that was immediately in weeks overturned by corrupt right-wing legislatures, right? So it's like, man, millions of dollars went into that victory, right? But then it was quickly overturned because right-wing legislatures or judiciaries were able to overturn that. So then you have to step back from that win and look at the interplay of forces. That's actually more important than we won 5 pieces of legislation or we won 10 pieces of legislation. It's the interplay of forces. It's the correlation of forces. That is more of a complex story and more of an accurate story. And so I think it would take a paradigm shift away from the, you know, kind of economizing, metricizing everything so that we could attempt to like explain backwards through metrics how something happened.
So I have a quick follow-up question from Megan on this point. Maurice, that you've been talking about the tolerance for failure, which Megan, you had noted earlier. And it makes, as you were talking, Maurice, it makes me think of the book State Capture by Alex Hertel Fernandez, a different notion of capture than yours, Megan. But what I appreciate about the book is it challenges the conventional wisdom we often tell ourselves. Oh yeah, the right wing in the 1970s, they wrote this power memo and then executed flawlessly on all their stuff. And that's how they came to power. Whereas like, no, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of failures on the right that they learned from to actually take and hold governing power. So help us understand, Megan, I just would love for you to respond to anything you heard from Maurice here. What should be tolerable failures that philanthropists should be thinking about when it comes to movement building?
Oh my goodness. I was just over here. I had to mute myself because I was like having some type of church over here, clapping and amening so much of Maurice had said. I also wrote down, and I just want to just amplify this, standing in the theater of discomfort and how important that is. And in the last probably about 2 minutes of his remarks, really talking about the importance of the symbiotic, in some ways, relationship between so-called successes and so-called failures, right? That there's a great work of Eve Weinbaum, who I believe was a student of Kathy Cohen, who was also advisor of Doreen Warren here, who is focused on organizing in Appalachia, and she uses this concept of successful failures. But in terms of, I think it's so important to focus on kind of that ecosystem, because we don't ever have, there's just not just kind of this, to use Maurice's not kind of concept of this bubble that then bursts or pops as the win, and then other things that are failures. But all of the so-called, what some might point to as failures, are often learning opportunities that make the way for so-called success to happen later on. And that is the, I mean, whether it's on the left and or on the right, that has been the story of successful social movements in this country always. Is that there is all this learning that happens when people do not actually, or movements do not achieve everything that they want to achieve, right? That we don't get a Black Lives Matter in 2020 without the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, without NAACP, without Ida B. Wells, right? And it's not that Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching struggle at the end of the 19th century wasn't a success because lynchings didn't end in this country, right? That that it was successful in so many ways, but oftentimes not in the ways that some people think about success. And that there has been, I think, a dominant standard, especially it feels like in a lot of journalism and in American politics and academia, for focusing on a so-called institutional success and like legislative and political wins, and not on different types of success that happens in terms of change and shift in consciousness amongst people, and like different types of learning opportunities. And so I just really want to hold this idea about the symbiotic relationship and to not get so much caught up on what is success and what is failure. Still does not fully address the question that you started with here, Dorian, which is how do we get a little bit more comfortable or like what are tolerable failures? And the thing about it is, and why I think I'm uncomfortable answering that question, is that I'm not sure what tolerable failures are, right? I'm not sure what they mean. I think right now where I'm sitting, that most failures are tolerable because I'm not exactly sure what is a failure. I admit that even in my own work, I sometimes use the term failure, but I'm never comfortable, honestly, with that word, because in my own work about the NAACP in the early 20th century, I don't think anything they did was a failure. I think that sometimes what they did not meet everything that they wanted to, and wouldn't be understood in how people today would think of as success. And here I am wanting a different lexicon, right, of how we understand the ecosystem of movements. And the thing about it is, the thing that I think that frustrates me sometimes with funders, is they have the most freedom. This is something that my colleague Carmen Rojas often says, as president of the Marguerite Casey Foundation, that like in terms of politicians, they all happen to have all these constraints, but funders, especially individual philanthropists and oftentimes heads of foundations, have so much flexibility in terms of what they fund and how they conceive of things. They have the most freedom, right? That some of the rules that sometimes foundation heads think that they have are rules that are created by the sector or by themselves, right? And so that they can actually help to shift how we understand how the sector and also how many people in this country understand failures. And that's, I think, some of my frustration with kind of thinking about like, what are tolerable failures? You actually have the power to like help shift how we understand that. So do that, and quit acting and pretending that you're hobbled by something called failures, right? I just want so much more from people who I believe can give us so much more.
I will just make one quick editorial comment. I think there is also another way of coming at this from a movement or organizing perspective, and that is actually embracing the concept of testing to failure. What would that mean? If we were testing hypotheses about our theories of social change, testing them hard to fail so that we could learn something about what might succeed, however we define success. So it's just a different way of even coming into the question around tolerable failures. Like, what if we embrace failure? And that was actually part of the plan that we're testing to failure is another way to look at it. Okay, this is gonna be the speed round because I have one more question I have to get in, and then I do have to get one question from the Q&A. So here's my final very light question for the two of you very quickly. If you could do this in a minute or less. How can foundations reconcile with the ways that they have accumulated wealth, which some folks characterize as twice stolen wages? And what would an authentic truth and reconciliation process look like for philanthropy in America? In 1 minute or less.
Oh, okay. Well, wow. 1 minute. Okay. So I think, well, one of the things that philanthropy has to do, I think, is, and I could say a lot, but I think there needs to be an honest recognition that the thing that allows them to exist is the problem, like the overall economic system that allows such concentration of wealth that there is philanthropy. That's the problem. Like the thing that created the need for charity is also the thing that created the charity, right? And so I think that needs to be clear. And then therefore, if that's the case, it's all of our job to focus on that thing, the structural conditions of, and you don't need to be a Marxist Leninist to understand that our current economic system is incompatible with everything we just talked about, right? So what would it mean if we took seriously systems change on that level, right? And how are we transforming this economic system that has been in existence for the past and has been changing, right? But in existence for the past few hundred years, and has caused both the deep downside that people recognize, but also has caused the deep upside that has allowed for philanthropies to be able to be in the position to give, right? And how are philanthropies interrupting that so that they're not playing this role as the velvet glove of capitalism, but actually choosing to create a world where there's no need for philanthropy, right? I think that is the like resolution of that contradiction. That is the reconciliation, a commitment to doing that, an understanding that we shouldn't exist, right? That we are on the like our existence is one side of a coin. The other side of the coin is the deep depravity and the deep pain and suffering that we want to eradicate. In order to eradicate that problem, we also have to eradicate us, right? Like the conditions that allow us also allow the suffering, and we're completely comfortable with that, right? I think that would create different outcomes, and I know that's longer than a minute.
All good. I'm gonna ask you the same question. What's truth and reconciliation look like, Megan, and philanthropy in a minute or less? Because I do want to get in this one last question because it's so juicy and good. And you don't know what it is. That's why I want to get it in.
Right here. So this is so good. I think that just to kind of build a little bit off of what Maurice was saying, in so many ways, philanthropy can act as this kind of tool of capturing, sometimes co-opting. In some ways, it makes you need capitalism. It forces you into a capitalist relationship. It takes the derivatives and lessons from capitalism. It sometimes can obscure the perpetrators of violence and makes you think more narrowly about the causes of injustice. So I say that to say that there's two things that very quickly I want to focus on in my remaining 40 seconds, which is one, I think that moving forwards in terms of a truth and reconciliation process, what philanthropy can do is to make visible the relationships that philanthropy often tries to hide, right? So on that point, the kind of the relationship between racism and capitalism, democracy and violence, right? That's part of the Realizing Democracy series. And I think that, it's interesting. Oftentimes people ask me, they're like, how can we be better as an institution? And oftentimes, and kind of the focus is on things externally that funders can do. Right? No one actually wants to clean house, right? Everybody wants to like make everything on the outside look nice. And I think that where things should start is, what are you doing right now? And how are you shaping and reshaping and transforming the internal processes of your institution and the way in which you fund? Have you as an organization actually confronted the ways in which your organization or you as a person has perpetuated harm, right? Whether that is through the way in which your resources were accumulated, whether that is through harmful ways in which you have funded organizations in the past. But to me, kind of a real truth and reconciliation process starts with cleaning house at home. I feel like we've all been taught like at a very early age, like the house has to be clean, otherwise everything else is not going to be, right? That you can like window dress all you want. And that strikes me what a lot of philanthropy is trying to do. And so it needs to start there, and it needs to start with a lot of truth telling.
So I want to get to one of the questions from the Q&A from our good friend Domenico Romero from Veach, who asked, can you all share your thoughts on the possibilities of changing the structural relation between grantees and funders in ways in which those making change real through their movements and everyday organizing can have essentially more decision-making power in the ways funding is prioritized and operationalized? He goes on, participatory grant making is of course one way to look at it, of which there are some experiments going on. How can this help to fund the movement for the long term? What are the challenges that it implies for both philanthropy and organizations themselves? And if you could add in your response in a minute or less, because we are short on time, any closing thoughts you have as well will be more than welcome. So who wants to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. All right. So yes, absolutely. I think experiments with participatory grant making, like I was at a time involved with the North Star Fund and their participatory grant making work, and it was wonderful. I think giving more general operating money that is not project specific, right? That's saying, I trust you. That's what that says, right? And giving longer term also says, I trust you. And it provides the runway for folks to have more control and more say, right? So I think structurally shifting philanthropy to be that. The other thing I'll say is that it is not true. It actually is not true that the people with money have more value, right? And so making that real in the relationships between the grantor and the grantee, right? Making it real and true in that relationship, I think will unlock a lot of what's necessary. So there's an understanding that, like, yes, we have money, but the money in its inert form has no value. The money is only animated by ideas, and the money is only animated by strategies that come from the ground, right? So the thing that is of the most unique value is actually coming from the ground. And how do we be in right relationship where we're actually respecting that relationship? I think that requires a lot of intentionality, but if that is the commitment of folks on both sides, that we will be in right relationship where we respect the value, the unique value of the strategist, right? And the commonplace value, the ability to be able to move money, right? And so I think that is actually inside that relationship. I think you'll find a lot of those answers.
Amen. Okay, Megan.
Oh my goodness.
At 100 miles an hour, you have 60 seconds. Doc.
Okay, because I have no time. I agree with everything that has been said thus far. I think the other thing for me that's key in terms of changing the dynamics of power between grantees and funders is by organizing needs to happen in between organizations around funders, right? That funders get in terms of whether that's a type of name recognition that happens. But for me, in terms of like, how do we provide resources to organizations to actually do that type of work? I think that as I've been trying to figure out how to, whether it's reform or transform philanthropy, that it won't happen unless philanthropy does not exist anymore. And it strikes me that there's a lot of funders who are fighting to survive and for their jobs without thinking more broadly about what is necessary to live in a world whose values are what they purport to actually care about. And so for me, it's organizing actually amongst grantees and how do you provide the resources and, or as Marie said, the runway to actually do that.
Perfect and well done. And that leads me to our close. So I want to thank our partners at The Forge again for sponsoring and hosting this conversation. And of course, our rock star, fabulous panelists, Megan and Maurice. I could talk to you for 2, 3, 5, 10 more hours about this. So thank you so much, not only for your time, for your work as well. And I also want to shout out Kevin Simowitz and the entire team that helped to organize all of us here today. As a reminder, you can see the Movement Capture video featuring Maurice and Megan at realizingdemocracy.org. And we'll also post the video of this conversation on the website as well. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we will see you out there in the streets.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.